everybody, and welcome to another Storytime with Sid. It is me, Sidney of Hightower. Who would have guessed? And welcome. I hope you'll join me for another story, because this one is pretty cool. It's a bit shorter, like the one last week, but I think you guys will appreciate it because it has to do with two people that I think need to be represented more in modern stories. So I'm very excited to read this one for you today. This is called The Shepherdess and the Chimney Sweep. Let's get started. Have you ever seen a very old wooden cupboard, all black with age and carved with curlicues and foliage? That's exactly the kind that stood in the parlor. It was inherited from great-grandmother and carved with roses and tulips from top to bottom. It had the strangest curlicues, and among them poked out a tiny stag head with jagged antlers. But in the middle of the cupboard, a whole man had been carved. He was certainly ridiculous to look at, and smirk he certainly did. You couldn't call it laughing. He had goat legs, tiny horns on his forehead, and a long beard. The children in the parlor always called him Billy Goat Legfield Marshal Brigadier General Commander Sergeant, because it was a hard name to say, and there aren't many who have such a title. He was always looking at the table, under the mirror, because that's where an elegant little shepherdess made of porcelain stood. Her shoes were gilded, her gown charmingly tucked up with red rose, and she also had a golden hat and a shepherd's crook. She was lovely. Right next to her stood a little chimney sweep as black as coal, yet also made of porcelain. He was just as clean and handsome as anyone else. He was just pretending to be a chimney sweep. The porcelain maker could just as well have made him a prince, because it made no difference. There he stood, holding his ladder in such a charming manner, and with a face and as beautiful as a girl's. That was actually a mistake, because he should have been at least a little sooty. He stood quite close to the shepherdess. They'd both been set where they stood, and since then they had been placed there, they'd become engaged. They suited each other, after all. They were young, they were made of the same porcelain, and they were both equally fragile. Close to them stood another doll who was 3 times as big. It was an old man who could nod. He was also made of porcelain, and said that he was the grandfather to the little shepherdess, although he couldn't prove it. He claimed to have authority over her, and that's why he was nodding to Billy Goat Legfield Marshal Brigadier General Commander Sergeant, who had asked for the hand of the little shepherdess. "Now there's a husband for you," said the old man. "A husband that I think might be well made of mahogany. He can make you Mrs. Billy Goat Legfield Marshal Brigadier General Commander Sergeant. He has the whole cupboard full of silverware, not to mention what he keeps in secret cubby holes." "I don't want to live inside the dark cupboard," said the little shepherdess. "People say he has 11 porcelain wives in there." "Then you can be the 12th, said the old man. "Tonight, as soon as the old cupboard starts to creak, you will be married, as surely as I am an old man." Then he nodded his head and fell asleep. But the little shepherdess wept, and looked at her heart's beloved at the porcelain chimney sweep. "I think I have to ask you to go with me out into the wide world," she said, "because we can't stay here." "I'll do anything you like," said the little chimney sweep. "Let's leave right now. I feel certain I can support you with my profession." "If only we could get down from this table," she said. "I won't be happy until we're out in the wide world." And he reassured her and showed her where to put her little foot on the carved edges with the gilded foliage around the table leg. He also used his ladder, and then they reached the floor. But when they looked over at the old cupboard, there was such a commotion going on. All the carved deer were sticking the heads farther out, lifting their antlers, and turning their heads. Billy Goat Legfield Marshal Brigadier General Commander Sergeant leaped high into the air and shouted at the old man, "They're running away! They're running away!" When they were both quite frightened, and quickly jumped into the drawer beneath the window seat. Inside lay 3 or 4 incomplete decks of cards, and a little puppet theater that had been cobbled together. A play was being performed, and all the queens, both diamonds, hearts, clubs, and spades, sat in the front row, fanning themselves with their tulips. Lovely, lovely tulips. Behind them stood all the jacks, displaying their heads both up and down, the way cards do. The play was about 2 lovers who couldn't be together, and the shepherdess cried because it was just like her own story. "I can't stand any more of this," she said. "I have to get out of this drawer." But when they came out to the floor and looked up at the table, the old man was awake, and his body was wobbling all over, because his lower half was all one piece. "Here comes the old man!" shrieked the little shepherdess, and she fell to her porcelain knees, she was in such despair. "I have an idea," said the chimney sweep. "Why don't we crawl into the big potpourri jar that's standing in the corner? We can lie there with the roses and lavender and throw salt in his eyes when he comes near." "I wouldn't recommend it," she said. "And besides, I happen to know that the man and the potpourri jar were once engaged, and a little affection always remains when you've been in love like that. Now we have no choice but to go out into the wide world." "Are you sure you have the courage to go out with me into the wide world?" asked the chimney sweep. "Have you considered how big it is? And we'd never be able to come back here." "Yes, I have," she said. And the chimney sweep stared at her, and then he said, "My path goes through the chimney. Are you sure you have the courage to crawl with me through the wood stove, through both the belly and the pipe? Then we'll be into the chimney, and that's where I know how to use my skills. We'll climb so high they won't be able to reach us, and at the very top is an opening that leads out into the wide world." And he led her over to the door of the stove. "How dark it looks in there," she said, but she followed him, both through the belly and through the pipe, where it was like pitch black night. "Now we're inside the chimney," he said, "and look, look! Up above the loveliest star is shining." It was a real star in this night sky that was shining down on them, as if to show them the way. And they crawled and climbed. It was an awfully long way, higher and higher. But he lifted and helped her. He held on to her and showed her the best place to sit her porcelain feet. Then they reached all the way up to the very edge of the chimney and sat down on it, because they were tired, of course, and they had every right to be. The sky and all its stars were overhead. All the rooftops in town were below them. They looked all around, far out into the world. The poor shepherdess had never dreamed it would be like this. She leaned her little head against the chimney sweep, and then she wept so hard the gold came off her sash. "It's too much," she said. "I can't stand it. The world is much too big. If only I were back on the little table under the mirror. I'll never be happy until I'm there again. I've followed you out into the wide world, so now you can follow me home if you're the least bit fond of me." And the chimney sweep spoke sensibly to her, talking about the old man and Billy Goat Leg Field Marshal Brigadier General Commander Sergeant. But she sobbed even harder and kissed her little chimney sweep. So he had no choice but to give in, even though he knew it was a mistake. And so they crawled with great difficulty back down the chimney. They crept through the pipe into the belly of the stove. It wasn't at all pleasant. Then they stood inside the dark stove. There it was very quiet. They peeked out. Oh, there in the middle of the floor lay the old man. He had fallen off the table when he tried to come after them, and now he was broken in 3 pieces. Oh no! His whole back had come off in one piece, and his head had rolled into a corner. Billy Goat Leg Field Marshal Brigadier General Commander Sergeant stood where he always stood, thinking things over. "How awful!" said the little shepherdess. "Old grandfather has been smashed to bits, and it's all our fault. We'll never be able to endure it." And she started weeping into her tiny little hands. "He can be mended," said the chimney sweep. "He can easily be mended. Don't take it so hard. When they glue on his back and put a strong rivet in his neck, he'll be as good as new and able to say many more unpleasant things to us." "Do you think so?" she said, and they climbed back up to the table where they had stood before. "Well, look how far we got," said the chimney sweep. "We could have saved ourselves all that trouble." "If only we had old grandfather mended," said the shepherdess. "Do you think it's expensive?" And mended he was. The family had his back glued on, and a strong rivet was put in the nape of his neck. He was as good as new, though he could no longer nod. "You've certainly grown haughty since you were smashed into pieces," said Billy Goat Leg Field Marshal Brigadier General Commander Sergeant. "But I don't think that's anything to brag about. Is she gonna be mine, or isn't she?" The chimney sweep and the little shepherdess gave the old man such pleading looks. They were so afraid that he was going to nod. But he couldn't. and he felt uncomfortable telling a stranger that he had a permanent ribbon in the nape of his neck. So the porcelain couple stayed together, and they blessed grandfather's rivet and loved each other until they broke. And that was the story of the Shepherdess and the Chimney Sweep. See, wasn't that adorable? It's so interesting seeing stories about inanimate objects coming to life, because there's something so special about that little part of magic that's very rarely talked about. And it definitely teaches you to respect everything as if it's a living thing. Because truly, you never know. Thank you so much for joining me for another story, and I hope to see you again next week when we read another one, and then 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 another one, and another one, and we'll just keep going. Thank you so much, and please stay happy, healthy, and safe.